told you that this case is about the tragic death of Nicole Vanderheiden. And just like in their opening statement, the state completely ignored that they chose to arrest Doug Dietrich for that crime. They didn't tell you about it in their opening statement when they told you they were going to give you the roadmap of what happened. They ignored it. Now, this case involves so much emotion. We've seen it all. We've felt it together. Every person in this courtroom has. There's sadness, tragedy, nervousness, stress, anger. It's the full array. That's what you would expect in a case like this. But it's also important to focus on the facts of this case. The facts show you that Doug Dietrich committed this crime. Justice for Nicole is not going to be delivered by a wrongful conviction of George Burch. Doug Dietrich had the motive, the opportunity, and the connection to this crime. Now, when the state talked to you about the motive that George Burch would have, that's completely fabricated. It's brought out of thin air. You didn't hear any evidence to provide a reason why George would commit it, so they had to make it up. You heard strong reasons why Doug Dietrich would commit this crime. Nikki had a voice on May 20th and May 21st. And remember those text messages. Remember what she was telling Doug Dietrich as their fight was just beginning. That was strong evidence when the state arrested Doug Dietrich. The state says you can't believe Mr. Burch's testimony. You can't believe his story. They called it outlandish. They said it challenged your education and your intelligence. They called it ridiculous. Those are their words. The prosecutor came up here and told you that. That's not the first time that a prosecutor has said that. We've heard those words before. At Oshkosh, there's a professor. That professor is also a criminal defense attorney. And he taught a Tuesday night class. It was a 3-hour class. And towards the end of the semester, he always had a question and answer session. And there's always the same question. Professor, how do you do your job? How are you a criminal defense attorney? He never responded with a long explanation or diving into philosophy or theory. No, he had a story. His story was about a client that he represented. That client had recently become a father. He didn't have custody of his daughter, but he was starting to gain visitation rights with her. He loved his daughter. Now, right around when his daughter was 1 year old, he was able to take her for the weekend on a Saturday. And he took her to the stores, he took her out and about. It wasn't planned, but he was excited because he got to be with his daughter. It was a normal day. He brought his daughter home. Later that day, the mother, the grandparents went to change this little girl's diaper. This little girl had blood in her diaper. How do you explain that? You call the police. The police arrest somebody. That's how. That's where the professor comes in. He's a criminal defense attorney. He eventually gets all the evidence in the case, all the discovery. It doesn't come in right away, but as it's coming in, he's reviewing it. He's got to represent this guy now. He has to go talk to him. And he does that. He goes to talk to his client to see what they're going to do, what's going to happen. And his client is beside himself. I didn't do this. I didn't do this. But I also can't explain how. The only thing he could even think of when he racked his entire mind was that when he was at the DMV, he had put his daughter on a low shelf, and she had fallen and hit perfectly on a metal wastebasket. That's the story that the criminal defense attorney had to now investigate, because that's his job and that's his duty. So he went and he did it, and he investigated. He had to go to the DMV and request their surveillance video. He almost felt ashamed even having to request it. He got the video, he was watching it, and he's watching it, and there's his client with the daughter. And she falls just exactly how that person said, just how the client said she fell. It validated his client's story, but that's still not proof. That still doesn't explain that. So he had to go to a doctor. And he went to the doctor, and the doctor explained those injuries are consistent. That actually helps us explain what happened to this girl. Seemed ridiculous. But if there wasn't that surveillance video, that man would have gone to prison. He would have been wrongfully convicted. The state would call that ridiculous. They would have said the same things today, just because they can't believe that story. Just because a story sounds ridiculous or sounds unbelievable doesn't mean it is. And I ask that you focus on all the evidence in this case, that you don't continuously ignore that the state arrested Doug Dietrich and there's a full-scale investigation into Doug Dietrich. We've seen the evidence. We've seen him testify. He had the motive, the opportunity, and the connection to this crime. The first piece of evidence I ask that you focus on is when Doug Dietrich actually called the police. He didn't call the police until after Nikki's body was found. You heard the testimony. Nikki's body was found sometime at right around 2 o'clock. There was a huge police buildup, blockades, cars. You heard that young farmer boy tell you when he left the field, he went car to car. That's how many police officers were there. Doug Dietrich chose not to call the police until 4:37. He could have explained why. He didn't have a good explanation for that. You saw him on the stand. Nikki was gone. He knew why. He didn't want the police to come. He was trying to cover up what he did. You heard testimony about Nikki's Buick rendezvous. You heard a lot of testimony about it. Remember this testimony of Donald Chick. Donald Chick is a 28 years on the force of the Green Bay Police Department, a retired, experienced officer, trained to observe and report, to accurately take note of the situation in front of him. He knew the Dietrichs. He knew Doug Dietrich. He knew 2329 Berkeley Road. And when he drove by on the morning of May 21st, there was no vehicle in the garage. He remembered that specifically. 2 days later, he knew he had to call police. He knew he had to report it. He also heard that there were spare keys in the house. And you heard testimony that those were a valet key. Sergeant Slinger said that those keys wouldn't start the vehicle. But that defeats the entire purpose of what a valet key is. We know that vehicle moved. Don Chick told you that vehicle moved. It was not there. What about the snapshot data? Well, technology can fail us. Think about a GPS, like we've talked about in this case before. When we talked about it, when we picked the jury. What do you do when you have a GPS unit telling you to drive into a lake? You are there as the eyewitness, and this technology is telling you to go straight into the lake. GPS units, trillions probably of miles covered. They'll tell you it's accurate 97% of the time, or whatever that number is. Do you drive into the lake? No, because you're an eyewitness there. Eyewitness testimony can be more important than technology itself. You can't ignore Don Chick's testimony. He told you he even had a nickname on the force for being so observant. The state wants you to completely ignore this officer's testimony. You can't pick and choose which officer's testimony you bring out. Now, Don Chick was not the only person that saw something suspicious on May 21st at 2329 Berkeley Road. Remember Lisa Skaletsky? She has 3 young boys, all of them are in college now, but they were teens in high school at that time. She took that stand, she didn't know Doug. But she took the stand and told you there is somebody standing in the driveway sometime before noon talking on the phone. That male, medium build, on his phone before noon. She didn't know who Doug was. She doesn't have an interest in any of this. But she eventually found out who Doug was because she saw him on the news and she put it together. That was Doug Dietrich. How does the state explain that? Doug Dietrich didn't explain that. He said he was sleeping. The phone tech can't explain that because they said his phone wasn't working. Did he have a second phone? Is that phone air? I don't know. I can't tell you. I don't have to. It's not Mr. Burch's burden in this case. It's the state's. 2 eyewitnesses that discredit what Doug Dietrich was doing. And now let's talk about the third report. Somebody called in a suspicious person walking by that creek by 2329 Berkeley Road. So what did they do? What did officers do? They sent the dive team to search that little brown creek that you saw on the map. They didn't search the giant 3 ponds behind the house. They had a dive team. They didn't do that. A third suspicious report of activity in that area. That person was Doug Dietrich. He had been seen by Lisa Skaletsky. And then the other part that I asked that you focus on from Donald Chick's testimony is what else he saw. He didn't just see an empty garage. He saw a blue SUV parked with the door open with a woman, medium build, blonde. Who was that? Why was Nikki's vehicle gone? Where was it? Those are questions that aren't answered. The second big case, or big piece in this case, is motive. The state doesn't have to prove motive as much as they try. Their motive of Mr. Burch is fabricated. It's made up. There's not evidence of that. Those are conclusions that they're making. They're allowed to argue here. It's still not in the evidence. So George Burch had no motive to commit this crime. George Burch took the stand. He came in here and we got his background information because it's important. Because you need to know who he is as a person. He doesn't tell his kids that he's on probation, but he doesn't have to be a good father. You heard how he communicates with them. He even learned to play video games so that they could communicate online and he could stay in touch with them. That's a loving father. That's a caring father. You saw the emotional reaction, and for the state to scoff when he was talking about his father just shows the strength of their actual arguments. He loved his father. His father was a role model. He was a loving father and a loving son. You also heard about his work ethic. George Burch was a hard worker. Anywhere he ended up in life, he would find a job right away, whether it was Virginia, New York, or Wisconsin. And you even heard the way George talked about his ex-wife. Their marriage might not have ended happily, but he still loved her. And you heard that. You saw that when he testified. He took that stand and he showed real emotion. Now, who had motive to kill Nicole? Where does motive actually exist in this case that we've seen in the evidence? Doug Dietrich had the motive to kill Nicole. Let's talk about their general relationship. He got on the stand and told you that wedding bells were in the future. He talked about how Dylan Vanderheiden was going to walk his mom down the aisle. Notice he didn't tell you that just 2 weeks, not even 2 weeks prior, he was texting and communicating with his mother that in fact they were going to break up. That Nicole was going to go on her way with the kids too. It was not a happy relationship. Greg was a close personal friend to both, Greg Matthew. And he testified he saw them fight. Now, they fought like a normal couple would. But even Greg, somebody that is close to them, didn't know that Doug wasn't working because the relationship was on the rocks. Greg didn't know that the relationship was in a funk. And he's a close personal friend. You heard that the relationship was indeed in a funk and that Doug wasn't working. That was not a good relationship. You can see that boiling underneath. And then that brings us to May 20th and May 21st. Nikki wanted to go out. She wanted to have a good time. You heard her in Dallas talking. She was excited for a date night. She got to go out. She didn't get to go out often. And she got to go out with Doug. Doug had other priorities. Doug's priorities were his other friends, drinking, drugs, and Nikki when she was around. Now, when they went to the watering hole, things started okay. Things started great, it sounded like. They were having a decent time. But it wasn't long until they separated. It wasn't long until the argument started. You heard how that escalated from Nikki's point of view. We heard some of Nikki's last words through text messages to Doug. She called him abusive. She said he hurts her. And they were about infidelity. Those three things. Now, Doug Dietrich was on that stand. He could have explained any of them to you. He could have taken ownership for any of that. He didn't know why. That's what he said today. And you're supposed to believe that. He just didn't know why she would say those things. We all know why she would say those things. Maybe alcohol finally gave her the courage to come out and say them straight to Doug. And then Doug finally got home, still didn't really care where Nikki was. And he caught them. He caught Nikki with George Burch. So you have a relationship that's on the rocks. You have this boiling fight. And then you have George with Nikki. Those are each by themselves sufficient to prove motive. Altogether, that creates the ultimate crime of passion. The ultimate motive. Remember, George had no motive to commit this crime. None. That's a huge hole in the state's case. You also need to focus on the next day. It's now May 22nd. People had started to find out that Nikki had passed. People were sad. She clearly had a lot of people that cared about her. We've seen that in this process. One of those people was Dallas Kennedy. Dallas was trying to stay in touch with Doug to see what's happening. And when she called Doug, she was upset in general. Her friend had passed. And she finally said to Doug, "Doug, what happened?" That is a direct question. "Doug, what happened?" And Doug said, I don't know. She hit her head and walked home. She hit her head. Not a single law enforcement officer had told Doug the injuries to Nicole. Not one. You heard Investigator Shield get on the stand and tell you there are certain indicators of guilt. When he goes on a homicide investigation, when someone is referring to the victim in the past tense, that's a sign of guilt. You know what another sign of guilt is? When you bring up a fact that you shouldn't know. When you bring up a fact that you wouldn't know unless you were there. Unless you killed that person. How would Doug know that Nicole was hit in the head? That's a confession. Now, I also want you to focus on Dr. Rogalska's testimony. Dr. Rogalska testified that there is a repetitive pattern on Nicole. That repetitive pattern was in a D or a U shape. She said that that repetitive pattern means that it could have been caused by a non-natural object. That's the technical term for telling you there is a missing murder weapon in this case. A missing murder weapon in the D or U shape. Remember that 1 or 2 inch hole in Mr. Dietrich's residence. Think about what the bottom of a gun looks like, a bottom of a handgun, and what shape that is. We can't tell you whether or not any of those things were used because Dr. Rogalska didn't have a way to compare it to those injuries. There is a missing murder weapon in this case, and we can't tell you where it is. Mr. Burch cannot tell you where it is. But again, he does not have to. The state bears the burden in this case. It is their job. They need to explain why there is a missing murder weapon in this case, and they have not done so. They didn't even bring it up. What they did bring up, remember all those photos of the blue and white shoes with the M pattern. They also highlighted the herringbone pattern on Nicole's back. They wanted that in your minds. They showed that photo over and over. Think about that M or V pattern and those blue and white Nike Shox. I don't know if the state was caught off guard or if they were doing it intentionally, but we heard later that those weren't even George Burch's shoes. Those M or V patterns. Those were Matt Wassenberg's shoes. They're not trying to say Matt Wassenberg was a part of this. In fact, George Burch didn't even live with Matt Wassenberg at that time. So it's not even like he could have even slipped those on. They didn't even have that right. Do you remember who had that M and V pattern in this case on their shoes? Doug Dietrich. Now, George says he doesn't know what hit him in the back of the head, but he eventually saw Mr. Dietrich with a handgun. We also know that Mr. Dietrich had a concealed carry permit. A concealed carry permit is so that you can have a handgun and conceal it. You don't do that with a shotgun. You don't do it with a rifle. Police didn't find a billy club or a taser at his house. You have a handgun. No handgun was ever recovered. This missing murder weapon was never recovered. Are they in the ponds behind the Dietrich house on 2329 Berkeley Road? Are they in the East River or along the East River Trail? Again, George Burch can't tell you. We can't tell you. It's not our job to tell you. It's the state's. One of the things that could have helped the state find that murder weapon is if George would have come forward right away. He should have come forward right away. He knows that. He told you it was wrong. He took ownership for that right there on the stand. And just because he didn't come forward right away doesn't mean he's guilty of this crime. He was able to explain what happened on that stand. He wishes he had gone to the police right away. He wouldn't be sitting in that chair. Also remember these pictures. These are just a subset of all the photos we saw of the Dietrich residence and Nicole's house. It was a messy area. It should be. They had a kid. We get that. We're not trying to say it was a dirty house and they're bad people. That's not what we're trying to say. But what Sergeant Detective Yankee told you was that was inconsistent with the house reeking like a cleaning agent on May 23rd. Who was cleaning in that house? What were they cleaning in that house? Because it sure wasn't anything that Detective Sergeant Yankee could tell you. And remember who she is. A very experienced professional. Somebody who has risen up the ranks of the Brown County Sheriff's Detective Unit. She uncovered that smell and noticed that it didn't appear to fit that scene. And it wasn't a room, it wasn't an area, it was the entire first floor. It was the entire second floor. That's a strong smell. Was a weapon being cleaned? Was the sweatshirt that Doug Dietrich was wearing on that night being cleaned? Remember, George said Doug was wearing a sweatshirt. He saw that. No sweatshirt went to the lab to be tested. We know Doug Dietrich had sweatshirts. We also know Doug Dietrich followed his normal routine that night and took his clothes off. Remember that. Remember how specific he was able to get when he told you about following his morning routine at 3:10 a.m. on May 21st. He was able to be so specific at such a critical moment, even though he seemed to not remember anything else. Why would that be? But if he followed that routine, which he said he did, his clothes were off. If his clothes were off, it doesn't matter what shirts they sent to the lab to be tested, because he would have had to put something else on. Is that what he was cleaning? Is that what the smell of that cleaning agent was? Also remember all the cables and cords we've seen in these photos. There's boxes of them. There's areas of them. And remember the cords from the garage, the cables from the garage. 2 bundles of them. Similar length, similar style. They had that outer sheath. They had the frayed metal at the end. Some of them were even silver. It's not just a coincidence that those same type of cables were used in this crime. It's not a coincidence. We know where Doug Dietrich got those cables from. He had other cables just like them in his garage. These are the images you saw today, taken from Doug Dietrich's phone. The images that show Doug Dietrich knew of that area. But you don't have to rely on those photos. You can rely on Doug Dietrich's testimony. His testimony said he knew Berkeley Road. He knew Hoffman Road. He went to Ziggy's, which was right by where the body was found. That was a family restaurant. This just helps confirm it. He knew that area. He knew it well. The state wants to argue that he would have hid the body somewhere else then. They're trying to guess what Doug Dietrich was doing in an absolute panic. He had just killed the mother of his child. And he's supposed to act in that most rational basis? He went to somewhere he was familiar with, somewhere he knew. Somewhere that had trees, tall grass, and was off the road. What Mr. Dietrich didn't calculate was that field was being farmed now. You heard Dick Vandehei get up on the stand and tell you that that was a new area to be farmed. That was a new area. They had to pull the rocks. They had to prepare it to farm. Doug didn't count on that. He didn't know about that. But just as important, you have to remember that George Burch had no idea about this area. The state has said it multiple times. Even their opening, they told you he had no idea where he was going. None. He's from Virginia. He lived in New York. He had never been in here, in this area. You have to paint the picture. The entrance into that field from Hoffman Road. It's pitch black. There's no signs. No way of knowing that that entrance is there. But what's just as important is we want you to rely on that Gmail data. We want you to use the Google location data. Remember how long that trip took from Berkeley Road to that farm field. Under 6 minutes. That was a direct route from Berkeley Road to that field. And remember the driving distance that Google said it would take. 6 minutes. Doug Dietrich got George Burch and Nicole Vanderheid in there even quicker than Google suggested the drive would be. That is a direct path. George Burch would have no idea that that field was there. Pitch black. Doug Dietrich knew that field was there. He knew that area. He knew it well. You can't explain that away. And I also ask that you question their Fitbit data and their Fitbit evidence. The first thing I want to show you is a photo from the crime lab. Remember, they were there on May 24th. This is Doug Dietrich's office. What do you see in the bottom left of that photo? You see 2 more Fitbits. That right there is the black Fitbit, a black Fitbit. Remember, Doug's in jail. They allegedly have custody of his Fitbit. Which Fitbit are we talking about? Does that change the data? Does that help explain why Doug's DNA is not on the Fitbit? How does a Fitbit work? What's the error rate? Can you edit the data? I would love to know any of those things. The state didn't provide anybody who can help understand these questions. There's nobody that can help explain why multiple Fitbits could make a difference or would make a difference. Is that harmless error by the state? I don't know. I stand back and I think about all the experts you actually saw. DNA, medical examiners, footwear specialists, cable comparisons. Both cars were gone through by a crime scene analyst. You had professional photographers, professional videographers. You had progressive snapshot. We have every piece of damn technology in the world with an expert here, except for the Fitbit. Where is the Fitbit expert that can explain any of this and any of this data? Not here. Not in this case. Why did they not provide that expert? Why did they not want somebody to explain that data? Why did they not want someone to explain what would happen if there's multiple Fitbit units? Can you connect to multiple profiles? Different phones? We don't know. The state chose not to bring someone. A major piece of this, of all the evidence in this case, in the state's case, and our defense, is DNA. We didn't challenge any of the DNA findings by Mr. Scott. He seemed incredibly respected. His testimony came through clearly. And we told you right from the opening we weren't going to challenge it because it helps verify Mr. Burch's story. Just like the Google data. George Burch explained that he was having consensual sex with Miss Vanderheiden. That he had to carry her body to that field. That explains why his DNA was on Nicole. Now, why was George Burch's DNA on that cable? George took the stand. He didn't try to guess at it or try to explain it to you because he couldn't. because he was knocked out. He stayed consistent with that. You would think if he was trying to make up this elaborate story, he would have come up with some sort of explanation to everything. He didn't even try, because he didn't need to. He didn't know. He testified truthfully. You also heard Kevin Scott testify about secondary touch DNA. That means where your DNA can be on something without ever even touching it. Like if you touch somebody, you can take their DNA and transfer it. George told you that Doug had touched him. He told you that there was a physical altercation. Also remember the amount of George Burch's DNA on that cord or cable. 0.001 nanograms per microliter, the lowest possible level that the DNA expert could even test for. George can't explain that, and he hasn't tried. Did Doug Dietrich touch him with the cable? Was it secondary touch? George doesn't know, but there are clearly explanations for it at such a low level. Now, how does the state explain why Doug Dietrich's DNA was on Nicole's bloody underwear, bloody tank top, bra, and under her left fingernails? Now, it's not just Doug Dietrich's DNA. It's a Y chromosome, so it could be Doug or it could be Dylan. It does make sense why Dylan's DNA would be on Nicole's bra, because she was breastfeeding. We concede that. We're not trying to argue that. On the interior of the cup, that makes sense. The exterior of the cup, maybe it can get there. The clasp, we're starting to make less sense. Let's talk about underneath Nicole's left fingernails. Blood was there, and that same DNA. I don't think the state's trying to say Dylan was there. That was Doug's DNA. How about on her bloody tank top? Same scenario. Doug's DNA was there. Don't think they're trying to say Dylan's was. But maybe most damning to their case, on the interior and exterior of Nicole's bloody underwear that you saw today. How is that explained? Unless Doug Dietrich was there. Doug Dietrich confessed. She hit her head. We get all of these clues that show you that this isn't some open and shut case like the state said. They wanted to rest, apparently, after the DNA and after the Google data. They bear the burden in this case. There's no explanation for why that DNA would be there. Kevin Scott told you it's not like those clothes appeared to have recently been washed, that it would mix that DNA. There's no explanation for why Doug's Dietrich would be on the exterior and interior of Nicole's bloody underwear. Now these boards and these things that I've talked about, these are just problems or holes in the state's case. These are just pieces that don't make sense on their version of events. Each one is a piece, but when you take them all together, they grow into something much larger. This is just a hole in their case. You can't forget that this isn't even including all of the testimony that George Burch provided. He fills those holes of his own. He provided his story. He told you what happened on that night. Now when the prosecutor was cross-examining George, there's a reason why attorneys start to yell and why they start to build their voice, why they suddenly stand up and start pointing when they haven't done that the entire time. There's a reason why you start to do this. Because you're only looking for an emotional reaction. Because you don't have the facts. Because you don't have the smoking gun. You don't have that. You yell. You try to get a reaction. George showed emotion. It was probably the most tragic day of his life. And he was being called a murderer. And he knew he should have called the police. So yeah, He showed emotion, as he should. I know somebody who was on the stand that didn't show much emotion at all. Now the state is going to get a chance to come back up and talk to you again. I'm not going to get that chance. Nobody else from the defense team is going to get that chance. There's a reason for that. That's because we and Mr. Burch bear no burden in this case. The state bears that burden, and it's a very large burden. And the judge has told you if there's a reasonable hypothesis of the facts that can reconcile with the evidence of Mr. Burch being not guilty, you should return a verdict of not guilty. As we sit here right now, you are literally surrounded by doubt. You are surrounded by reasonable doubt. That's why you must return a verdict of not guilty.